Hello there. Today we're delving into a topic that's not often touched on in Star Trek history, and that is the Earth-Romulan War. Not an entirely accurate description, as the belligerents actually participating in the conflict also canonically did include the Vulcans, Andorians and Tellarites, although we're not entirely clear what their entire contribution was to the conflict. Considering the state of the Vulcans at the time, it's likely that they weren't major military contributors, but the Andorians probably were more so, whereas the Tellarites probably more in a logistical sense. That's a hypothesis, as there's very little information as to what their participation was in the conflict. Of course, on the other side, there was the Romulan Empire, at least a fledgling one. To quickly put these two powers into perspective, we're going to quickly break down what their forces were like at this time. Technologically, the Romulans seem to have had an edge over Starfleet. They've been spacefaring much longer, and much of their technology was superior, including things such as stealth technologies as well as shielding. Their weapons, though, and other systems did seem to be on a rough par with that of Starfleet, although their ships were a little bit faster, although not as quick as a Vulcan vessel, although their maximum top speed isn't known. The Romulans attempted multiple times in the years preceding the war to destabilize the region, as they had plans for Vulcan. They wanted, of course, reunification just on their terms, and humans were getting in the way of it, as were peace with the Andorians and other things. As a result, the Romulans would attempt to destabilize it using advanced, modified, although older vessels used by the Romulans, controlled by telepresence. Another reason that no one actually knows what a bloody Romulan looks like at this time period, although we do know in hindsight the Romulans had good reason for hiding their appearance and didn't want anyone to know that them and the Vulcans were genetic cousins. Up until this point, the Romulans have been little more than a nuisance, interfering in internal politics on Romulus, attacking a few ships, killing a few people. Yes, all bad things, but compared to a war, relatively minor. But then the Earth-Romulan War started. It took place between the years of 2156 and 2160. The conflict primarily raged away from the main territories of both powers. In the early stages of the war, Starfleet was at a disadvantage. As I said, they had slower ships that were less technologically sophisticated and not as fast. Romulan vessels, as encountered by Starfleet, were more powerful, more heavily armed, faster, and they were a more aggressive, more belligerent power. But by the time of the war, Starfleet had had its fair share of belligerent encounters, such as engagements with the Xindi, even engagements with other minor races like the Suliban and even the Klingons by this point. Meaning Starfleet was no joke. They just, in terms of tactical capability, were not really on a par with the Romulans at this time. But as usual, Romulan arrogance and things would underestimate humanity, as many other races would. Vulcans were one of the few races that perhaps saw humans for their potential. They could be dangerous. Now, in the early stages of this war, as the Romulans first started to pay attention to humanity because of their interference with Romulan goals and plans for the Alpha Quadrant, the early vessels the Romulans would have encountered would have been basic freighters. They would have been one of the most numerous. Starfleet, of course, did have the NX class starship, but this was top of the line, top of the range, and they didn't exactly have many of them by 2156. In fact, as far as we know, there were only 2 operational starships, although there were multiple more under construction. Starfleet would have to resort to producing more simplistic vessels to engage in the war, resulting in the quality dipping but production increasing. But as I said, the first vessels the Romulans would have encountered, of course their first contact being in a minefield, the Romulans saw Starfleet ships as not quite as powerful as their own. These ships were slower, had no shields, were less heavily armed, and humans were not as aggressive. Not deemed initially a threat due to this, the Romulans mostly ignored them, but their association with the Vulcans simply couldn't be ignored. But humans were a scientific people. Starfleet's primary organizational system was that of scientific exploration, and most of their field of interest was actually in the Alpha Quadrant, not the Beta Quadrant. But by this point, the Romulans had started to pay attention and were watching. Starfleet, although only basically explored limitedly into the Beta Quadrant, it did take some interest in that region. It is mentioned, although never stated exactly how large Starfleet is, it's indicated that Starfleet has more ships than it necessarily you would think it would have by this point, mostly because the vessels it builds are small, cheap to produce, relatively simple ships that are A to B. These vessels, unfortunately, however, are relatively slow and not very well armed. Again, from a Romulan point of view, this would seem like humanity was a soft target, their ships not particularly threatening or very powerful. The Romulans continued to collect information on humanity in the build-up to this war in order to better understand their enemy and better position their own forces. After the undermining of Romulan efforts on Vulcan, it's theorized that this may have been the beginning of an increased level of Romulan interest and aggression in the area. Their subversion plans had been well subverted, and the only recourse they had left was open conflict. But they'd had time to prepare for it, and unlike humanity, they knew it was coming. In those early stages, in those early battles of the war, Starfleet did not come off the better. As I said, they only had a few NX-class ships that, although powerful and could give Romulan ships a run for their money, Starfleet didn't have enough of them, and would have to resort to tactics that were, as I said, more Second World War era on Earth, mass production over quality. The early stages, the Romulans would have encountered those freighters and other ships and simply had an easy time of destroying many of the outer bases and ships floating around out there, as humanity had spread itself out quite a bit. Also, their presence in the Beta Quadrant was minimal. Nonetheless, Starfleet was able to field some kind of resistance and halt a Romulan attack. One of the Romulans' problems was resources. Their power projection capability was limited, and they didn't want to completely risk alienating their Vulcan allies. Also, by this point, the Klingons would have deployed forces to their border, taking a little bit more interest in what was happening between these two powers now going to war. Starfleet would slowly begin to turn the tide of the conflict against the Romulans. With its cheap mass-produced vessels, it would drive the Romulans back and uproot the bases that they had created closer to human territory, although this was a slugging match, and humans, as far as we can tell, did actually take higher casualties in this conflict than the Romulans. Nonetheless, they were able to turn the tide quite impressively. We don't know much about many of the individual engagements of the war. We know that the war was very brutal, and that they even resorted to the use of nuclear armaments. One of the ships humanity would produce would be vessels like the Daedalus class, which actually had missile launch systems akin to those almost what you would have seen on an old Earth submarine, launching long-range ballistic, extremely fast, and we can presume much more powerful than 20th and 21st century nuclear ordnance, but nonetheless nuclear, because resources were getting a little strapped. And nuclear tech was, well, humans had a lot of it lying around for the last few decades, so why not upgrade it and use it? The Romulans seemingly resorted to the same thing. We also know that although it's likely some humans did actually see a Romulan during the war, they more likely would have encountered Reman, and any humans that saw them presumably had never described them or were killed or silenced in some way, perhaps even by Section 31 not wanting to undermine their alliance with the Vulcans and destabilize it, as humans could be. Bear in mind, after the Xindi conflict with the rise of Terra Prime and other such organizations, humans had been a little xenophobic and twitchy, and they were always a little twitchy towards the Vulcans to begin with. So learning that Vulcans and Romulans were related at the time when humanity was at war with the Romulans might not have been a good thing diplomatically. As I said, we don't know much about many of the battles, but we do know about three significant engagements that did take place that have been remembered. One is the Battle of Galorndon Core. Galorndon Core is a world that is within Federation territory. It's uninhabitable, its atmosphere is not exactly too pleasant, although it is barely breathable. It has one known moon, and was known to have been a Romulan defeat, where a Romulan commander known as Chulak was defeated at this location. Another was the Battle of Vocado. Vocado was a Romulan victory where a single Romulan ship defeated at least 2 Starfleet vessels using some pretty skillful maneuvering. And of course then there is the last one, the Battle of Charon. Interestingly, this was the last major battle of the war, which saw the Romulan forces fully routed and defeated, but we know almost next to nothing about the battle that took place. Who were the commanders? How many ships took part? We don't really know. All we know is that the Romulans were resoundingly defeated at this battle. It's likely, with humans ramping up their industrial output and Romulans not being as resource intensive as humanity, they probably thought they were going to get an easy win, a blitzkrieg if you will, and they didn't get it, and being drawn out into a protracted 4-year-long war, it's likely a combination of diplomatic pressure at home, potentially threats from other races that were also their enemies, the growing alliance in the region between the Andorians, the Vulcans, the humans, and the Tellarites, who were by now assisting humanity in the war, not to mention humans ramping up their industrial output. Although the ships were cheap, they were producing more of them. It's likely the Romulans couldn't destroy the human vessels faster than humans could defeat them. It's fair to say that Romulans also resorted to this tactic to a degree, but Romulans were less willing to compromise on their technological superiority and their technical skill than humans were, oddly enough. As a result, the Romulans began to lose ships faster than they could replace them, but they couldn't destroy ships on the other side as quick as humans could build them. And as a result, the Romulans eventually were forced to the diplomatic table. How that took place is a little unknown, very likely through a third party or via long-range communication. An armistice was signed and it led to the creation of the Romulan neutral zone, and a lot of bad blood on both sides that would still be felt 100 years later when humans would finally learn the truth of the kinship between the Vulcans and the Romulans, but that is another story. This is a very condensed version of the Romulan War, and it's just putting it into a basic overview. I might do a series, if this video gets enough traction, on more of a breakdown of the individual assets and ships and resources and materials that were utilized and fielded by both sides. Let me know in the comments below if that's something you'd be interested in, but I'm only going to do that if this video gets a lot of traction, as it wasn't that long ago I did a series quite heavily about the Romulans. That said, we're at the end of this video. As I said, it's only a condensed quick overview of the bullet points of the overall war that took place. If you did enjoy this video, please like, share, subscribe, comment down below and hit the bell notification icon if you want to stay up to date with any more episodes that are released on this channel, as that is the real subscribe button, not the subscribe button. Again, kind of ironically. With that said, I hope you enjoyed this video, and bye-bye. I'd just like to say a thank you to everyone for watching that video. I hope you enjoyed it. I really enjoy making these. If you did enjoy it, please consider giving a like, share, and a subscribe, and maybe checking out the other videos on the screen right now, and in the description box below there are links to my other social media accounts.